In 1941, while the world watched Nazi tanks roll across Europe and Allied forces fight for survival, another war exploded, one that almost no one remembers. It didn't happen in France. It didn't happen in North Africa. And it didn't even happen in Europe. It happened in Iraq. At the height of World War II, British forces found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off inside a country they claimed was their ally. Iraqi troops stood on the high ground, artillery aimed downward, encircling a British airbase in the desert. Inside that base were pilots flying training planes, mechanics with rifles, and commanders who knew one thing for certain: if this base fell, Britain could lose the Middle East. Oil supplies critical to the war effort, air routes linking Britain to India, and the illusion that the British Empire was still in control. This was not a German invasion. This was not an Axis army. This was Iraqi nationalists, backed by their own army, trying to throw Britain out once and for all. For weeks London hesitated. Berlin watched closely. And Baghdad stood at the center of a geopolitical gamble that could have reshaped World War II. Because if Iraq had succeeded in 1941, Britain's position in the Middle East might have collapsed entirely, opening the door to Axis influence, cutting imperial lifelines, and changing the course of the war. Yet today this conflict is barely mentioned in history books. No famous battles, no iconic generals, no victory parades, just a short, violent war buried in the shadows of history. This is the story of the time Iraq almost beat the British Empire, and why the consequences of that moment still echo across the Middle East today. To understand why Iraq rose against Britain in 1941, you have to go back not just a few years, but a few decades. At the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its Arab provinces were carved up by the victorious European powers. Iraq, a land that had been governed from Istanbul for centuries, suddenly found itself under British control. Officially, it was a League of Nations mandate. In reality, it was empire by another name. Britain installed a friendly monarchy, placing Faisal I, a Hashemite prince, on the throne in 1921. Iraq was given the symbols of a modern state: a king, a parliament, a flag, but real power remained firmly in British hands. British advisors sat inside Iraqi ministries. British officers trained the Iraqi army. And British companies controlled the country's most valuable resource, oil. In 1932, Britain declared Iraq independent. On paper, the mandate ended. But the reality was far more complicated. Under a series of treaties, Britain retained the right to station troops on Iraqi soil, to move forces through the country in wartime, and to control Iraq's foreign policy when imperial interests were at stake. Two major British air bases, RAF Habaniya and RAF Shaber, remained permanently manned. To many Iraqis, independence had changed the flag, but not the facts. This contradiction sat at the heart of Iraqi politics throughout the 1930s. A new generation of Iraqi officers and civil servants had grown up hearing promises of sovereignty, only to see British power enforced whenever it truly mattered. The Iraqi army, in particular, became a breeding ground for resentment. Trained by the British but denied real autonomy, many officers came to see themselves not as partners of the empire, but as its prisoners. At the same time, the world was changing rapidly. By the late 1930s, Europe was sliding toward another catastrophic war. Britain's empire stretched thin across the globe, and nowhere was its position more strategically fragile than in the Middle East. Iraq sat astride vital oil pipelines, air corridors linking Britain to India, and supply routes feeding British forces in Egypt and beyond. For London, Iraq was not just another former colony, it was a strategic keystone. For many Iraqis, that same fact made British influence unbearable. As nationalist movements gained strength across the Arab world, Iraqi politicians began to openly question whether alignment with Britain was worth the cost. Some looked instead toward Germany, not out of ideological loyalty to Nazism, but because Berlin appeared to be the only power capable of breaking British dominance. This was not a story of good versus evil. It was a story of power, survival, and unfinished independence. By 1941, Iraq was a country officially free, unofficially constrained, and increasingly unwilling to accept the arrangement. All it would take was a single crisis to turn political resentment into open rebellion. And that crisis was already on its way. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Iraq was already unstable, but the global conflict pushed it to the brink. Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939 and immediately began treating Iraq not as a sovereign partner, but as a strategic asset. Under the terms of earlier treaties, London demanded the right to move troops and supplies across Iraqi territory. Airfields were expanded. British units rotated in and out, and Iraqi leaders were reminded subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, who held real power. For many Iraqis, this confirmed their worst fears. Independence, they believed, was conditional and could be suspended whenever Britain found it convenient. Inside the Iraqi army, resentment hardened into ideology. A group of senior officers, later known as the Golden Square, came to see themselves as guardians of Iraqi sovereignty. They were not radicals or revolutionaries. Most had been trained by the British themselves. But they believed Iraq was being dragged into a European war that served imperial interests, not Iraqi ones. At the center of this growing opposition stood Rashid Ali al-Gailani. Rashid Ali was a seasoned politician and former prime minister, deeply hostile to British influence. He believed Iraq could only become truly independent by breaking free from London's grip, and World War II, he thought, provided the opportunity. With Britain fighting for survival in Europe and North Africa, the empire looked vulnerable for the first time in a generation. In April 1941, Rashid Ali made his move. Backed by the Golden Square officers, he overthrew the pro-British government and forced the regent Abd al-Ilah to flee the country. A new regime was proclaimed in Baghdad, one that declared neutrality in the global war, but in practice sought to end British military dominance in Iraq. London saw the coup as an existential threat. British officials feared that if Iraq slipped out of their control, the consequences would cascade across the Middle East. Oil supplies could be disrupted. Air routes to India could be cut. And worst of all, Germany might gain a foothold in a region Britain could not afford to lose. The standoff escalated rapidly. Britain demanded that Iraq honor its treaty obligations and allow additional British troops to land at Basra. Rashid Ali's government refused. Iraqi forces began mobilizing. Roads, railways, and airfields became contested spaces. Diplomacy hardened into ultimatums. Behind the scenes, Baghdad reached out to Berlin. German propaganda broadcasts flooded the Arab world, presenting the Axis as opponents of empire and champions of national self-determination. While Germany offered promises of support, it delivered little in concrete terms. Iraq would soon discover that sympathy did not equal logistics. By late April 1941, Iraqi troops moved to a position that made war almost inevitable. They surrounded RAF Habaniya, one of Britain's most important air bases in Iraq, placing artillery on the high plateau overlooking the base. It was a calculated show of force, a signal that the era of British immunity was over. Inside Habaniya, British commanders faced an impossible choice: accept the siege and risk destruction, or strike first and ignite a war neither side had formally declared. This was the moment where history narrowed. Had either side stepped back, the crisis might still have been diffused. But mistrust, pride, and fear now ruled the decisions of both governments. Within days, the last chance for a peaceful resolution would vanish. And the Anglo-Iraqi War would begin not with a declaration, but with a gamble. RAF Habbaniyah was never designed to fight a war. Built on the west bank of the Euphrates, it was primarily a training base, not a frontline fortress. Most of its aircraft were outdated training planes. Many of its personnel were mechanics, instructors, and cadets rather than combat veterans. And yet, in late April 1941, Habbaniyah suddenly became the focal point of Iraq's confrontation with the British Empire. Iraqi forces moved swiftly. By the end of April, thousands of Iraqi troops had occupied the plateau overlooking the airbase, placing artillery, machine guns, and armored units in commanding positions. From the high ground, they could see every runway, hangar, and barracks below. One well-coordinated bombardment could have rendered the base unusable within hours. The message was unmistakable. Baghdad demanded that British aircraft at Habbaniyah cease all flying operations. Officially, Iraq claimed it was enforcing its sovereignty. Unofficially, it was daring Britain to challenge it. Inside the base, the situation was desperate. British commanders knew they were outnumbered. Reinforcements were days, possibly weeks away. Supplies were limited. And the legal position was dangerously unclear. Iraq was technically an independent state. Any British attack could be framed as an act of aggression, not self-defense. For several tense days, both sides waited. Iraqi gunners stood ready on the plateau. British pilots sat in cockpits, engines idling, uncertain whether they would be ordered to fly or die on the ground. Each hour that passed favored Iraq. The longer Habbaniyah remained pinned down, the closer Britain came to losing control of central Iraq altogether. Then came the decision. In the early hours of May 2, 1941, British commanders chose to act first. Without a formal declaration of war, aircraft lifted off from Habbaniyah and struck Iraqi positions on the plateau above the base. Training planes were hastily fitted with bombs. Pilots flew repeated sorties at low altitude, accepting enormous risk in exchange for surprise. The effect was devastating. Caught off guard, Iraqi units scattered. Artillery was destroyed. Communication lines broke down. What had been a carefully positioned siege collapsed into confusion within hours. It was the decisive moment of the war. Had Iraqi forces fired first or maintained tighter discipline, the base might have fallen. Instead, hesitation proved fatal. Britain seized the initiative, transforming a vulnerable outpost into an offensive platform. From that moment on, the balance of the conflict shifted. The war that Iraq hoped to control was now being fought on Britain's terms. The fighting that followed the strike at Habbaniyah was short, chaotic, and decisive, but it was nothing like the swift nationalist victory Iraqi leaders had envisioned. Once the siege broke, British forces moved with speed and ruthlessness. At Habbaniyah, the airbase transformed almost overnight from a trapped garrison into an improvised air power hub. Training aircraft, many of them obsolete by European standards, were pressed into combat roles. Pilots flew relentless sorties, striking Iraqi troop concentrations, supply lines, and communications. The goal was simple: prevent Iraqi forces from regrouping. The psychological impact was enormous. Iraqi units, many of which had expected Britain to hesitate or negotiate, suddenly found themselves under continuous air attack. Morale faltered. Coordination broke down. What should have been a controlled military campaign became a series of fragmented responses. Meanwhile, Britain activated its wider imperial network. Troops began landing at Basra in southern Iraq, officially under treaty rights but now clearly part of a broader intervention. From Transjordan, a mobile British column later known as Habforce advanced toward Baghdad. Though small in number, these forces were experienced, well coordinated, and backed by air superiority. Iraq, by contrast, faced a strategic dilemma. Its army was large but poorly coordinated. Command authority was divided between politicians, senior officers, and regional commanders. There was no unified war plan, only the shared belief that Britain would not dare escalate. That assumption proved disastrously wrong. In desperation, Baghdad turned fully toward Germany. Berlin responded by dispatching a small Luftwaffe detachment and limited Italian air units operating from Vichy-controlled Syria. On paper, this was a dramatic escalation. In reality, it was too little, too late. German aircraft arrived without adequate fuel, spare parts, or ground support. Communication between Iraqi and Axis forces was minimal. Coordination was almost non-existent. The Axis intervention became symbolic rather than strategic. British intelligence quickly adapted. Airstrikes targeted German aircraft on the ground. Supply routes from Syria were disrupted. Within days, Axis losses mounted, and their operational impact dwindled to near insignificance. This was the war's most tragic irony. Iraqi leaders had bet on Germany as a counterweight to British power, but Germany never intended to commit the resources required to win in Iraq. With operations in the Balkans, North Africa, and preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Iraq was a secondary theater at best. The decisive advance came in mid-May. British columns pushed toward Baghdad, encountering only sporadic resistance. Iraqi units withdrew or surrendered, often without major engagements. Air superiority ensured that any attempt at organized defense was quickly neutralized. On May 30, 1941, British forces stood on the outskirts of Baghdad. Rashid Ali's government collapsed. Facing inevitable defeat, he fled the country, eventually finding refuge abroad. Within days, the pro-British regent was restored to power. The war, barely a month old, was effectively over. Yet the brevity of the conflict obscured its significance. Britain had not won because it was invincible. It had won because it acted faster, coordinated better, and exploited Iraqi hesitation. At several points, especially in the opening days, the outcome had been far from certain. Had Iraqi forces destroyed Habbaniyah immediately? Had Germany committed even a modest but sustained force? Had Iraqi command structures been unified? Britain's Middle Eastern position could have collapsed. Instead, Iraq's gamble failed not from lack of resolve, but from miscalculation. And the consequences of that failure would echo far beyond 1941. The end came quietly. There was no final battle for Baghdad, no dramatic last stand. By the final days of May 1941, the outcome of the Anglo-Iraqi War was already decided. British columns approached the capital as Iraqi resistance dissolved, not in chaos, but in exhaustion. On May 30th, Rashid Ali al-Gailani fled Iraq. His government collapsed almost overnight. The nationalist officers who had once spoken confidently of independence now faced arrest, exile, or worse. Within days, the pro-British regent Abd al-Ilah was restored to power under British protection. Officially, Iraq remained an independent kingdom. In practice, British authority had never been clearer. British troops re-entered Baghdad with strict orders to maintain order. Yet the atmosphere in the city was heavy, tense, and deeply resentful. For many Iraqis, the war's outcome confirmed a bitter truth. Challenging the empire came at a steep and immediate cost. The consequences were swift. Key nationalist officers were executed or imprisoned. Others fled abroad. The Iraqi army was purged of those suspected of disloyalty. British influence expanded further into Iraqi military planning and internal security. Any remaining illusion of political autonomy was stripped away in the name of stability. Britain also tightened its strategic grip. Air bases were reinforced. Supply routes were secured. Iraq became a fortified link in Britain's wartime logistics chain, feeding operations across the Middle East and beyond. The empire had survived, but only by force. Yet victory carried its own dangers. The British crackdown planted the seeds of future rebellion. The war left behind a generation of Iraqis who had seen how close independence had come and how brutally it had been crushed. The memory of 1941 would not fade. It would ferment. In the short term, Britain had restored control. In the long term, it had lost legitimacy. The guns fell silent, but the conflict between Iraqi nationalism and foreign dominance was far from over. It had merely been postponed. The Anglo-Iraqi War of 1941 ended quickly, but its consequences stretched far beyond its brief duration. In most accounts of World War II, the conflict barely registers. Overshadowed by battles in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, it is often dismissed as a minor colonial skirmish. But this war was forgotten not because it was insignificant, rather, because it was inconvenient. For Britain, 1941 in Iraq was not a triumph to celebrate. It exposed the fragility of imperial control. A supposedly friendly, independent state had nearly severed Britain's lifelines to oil, air routes, and India. Victory came not through overwhelming strength, but through improvisation, speed, and the opponent's mistakes. That was not the image the empire wished to preserve. For Iraq, the war became a suppressed memory. The nationalist movement failed, but it did not disappear. The officers executed or exiled in 1941 became martyrs to later generations. Their attempt to reclaim sovereignty, however flawed, set a precedent. Military intervention in politics became normalized. Coups, rather than elections, increasingly appeared as the path to change. 17 years later, in 1958, the Iraqi monarchy would fall violently, bringing to an end the political order Britain had built. The roots of that revolution ran directly through 1941. More broadly, the war revealed a pattern that would repeat across the Middle East. External powers intervening to secure strategic interests. Local movements seeking independence under impossible constraints. Short-term stability purchased at the cost of long-term resentment. The echoes of 1941 can still be heard today. Control of oil routes. Foreign military bases. Governments caught between domestic legitimacy and external pressure. The names have changed. The technologies have evolved. But the underlying struggle between sovereignty and strategy remains strikingly familiar. Most importantly, the Anglo-Iraqi War challenges the way we remember World War II. It reminds us that the war was not fought only on famous battlefields or between great powers. It was also fought in places where empire collided with nationalism, where the outcome shaped nations long after the shooting stopped. In 1941, Iraq came closer than history admits to breaking the British Empire's hold on the Middle East. It failed. But the attempt changed everything that followed. World War II is often remembered as a struggle between vast empires and powerful ideologies, a war decided by massive armies and famous battles. But history is also shaped by the conflicts we forget. In 1941, Iraq did not rise against Britain because it misunderstood the risks. It rose because it understood them all too well. Iraqi leaders saw an empire stretched thin, fighting for survival across multiple fronts, and believed briefly that independence was finally within reach. They were wrong. Britain did not win in Iraq through overwhelming force. It won through speed, experience, and a willingness to act decisively when hesitation might have been fatal. Iraq, by contrast, lost not because it lacked courage or popular support, but because timing, coordination, and international backing failed at the critical moment. Yet the significance of 1941 cannot be measured by victory alone. The war revealed the limits of imperial control and the cost of enforcing it. It hardened Iraqi nationalism, normalized military intervention in politics, and set the stage for decades of instability. What Britain preserved in the short term, it undermined in the long run. The Anglo-Iraqi War remains a footnote in World War II history, but its legacy is anything but small. It reminds us that empire is often weakest where it appears strongest, that independence delayed is rarely independence denied, and that missed chances can shape nations just as powerfully as triumphs. In the deserts of Iraq in the spring of 1941, the British Empire nearly broke. History moved on. But the echoes of that moment never truly faded. What if Iraq had won? It is a question historians love and one the participants never asked themselves in 1941, but the possibilities are striking. If Iraqi forces had struck Habbaniyah first, if German air support had arrived in full strength, if the Golden Square had coordinated more effectively with Iraqi regional units, Britain's hold on the Middle East could have crumbled. The vital oil fields feeding the war effort might have fallen under Axis influence. Air routes to India, crucial for moving troops and supplies, could have been severed. The war in North Africa might have faced entirely new logistical challenges. The world could have looked very different. Instead, Iraq's gamble failed, but it left a blueprint for resistance. The revolt of 1941 inspired later movements, proving that even the mightiest empire could be challenged if circumstances, timing, and determination aligned. And perhaps that is the true lesson. History is rarely inevitable. It is shaped by bold choices, miscalculations, and moments of courage that almost change everything. The Anglo-Iraqi War may be a footnote in the textbooks, but its echoes ripple through the Middle East to this day. If you want to uncover more hidden wars and forgotten stories, subscribe and hit the bell to never miss an upload. And let us know in the comments, what battle history forgot should we cover next?